name is Dr. Pete Meagher, and this is Man Parts, the podcast. I have with me today Maria Caruz, and she will be interviewing me for the first episode to lay the groundwork for the podcast. Maria, I will let you take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. So, my first question for you is could you give us a little insight into your background and what are we doing here today?
Yeah, thank you. Today we're talking about the foundations of Man Parts, where that came from, what that's about, and who I am. I have been working with men for over 3 decades. I have a master's in social work and a doctorate, and my journey started right after college when I was post Peace Corps, and I was invited to participate in a speakers bureau at the University of Wisconsin to talk to men about men's violence against women, and that introduction brought me into the conversation, and it was not something I'd really thought a lot about. It was not something that I had done any speaking on. So it was a brand new topic for me, but I was intrigued. And the more I learned about the topic, particularly men and gender and masculinity and our culture and the prevalence of violence, in particular violence against women, I was drawn into the topic, and it really changed my life. It helped me look at myself in a different way. It helped me think differently and act differently and be differently. The topic of gender was something completely new to me. So, and that experience was formative for me. I ended up really following a career in working with men and anti-violence work in the community. It started with a small group of men that I worked with, that I connected with, and we were invited into the schools. And we went anywhere they would take us. So we went into the campus, and then soon we're invited into anywhere from kindergartens to prisons to colleges to athletics to fraternities, sororities, residence halls, anywhere we would go. And that's really where I got my foundational start. From there, I ended up pursuing the work of violence prevention and working with men. And I did work with men at a local university on substance abuse and violence prevention. I then, in the early 2000s, started working specifically on men's violence against women, and worked at a small school on a comprehensive grant that was funded by the Violence Against Women Act. And I had the honor and privilege in working with the men and women of a small school here in Madison, Wisconsin.
Hmm.
After that, I ended up pursuing my doctorate and continued the work on college campus settings. And I'm currently an associate dean and director in the social work program. And I have a small private practice.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Um, Obviously you have a lot of experience, a whole lifetime of experience. And my next question is related to specifically the IFS part of this podcast. So I hear that it's IFS men and masculinity. Um, so could you give me a rough outline of what IFS is and how it relates to masculinity?
Yeah, thank you for that question. IFS, otherwise known as Internal Family Systems, has been around for several decades. It's a model of working with people to address, from a strengths perspective, mental health and well-being. It was invented by Dick Schwartz, and really out of a need to engage people with how they present themselves. And it was as simple as the idea with internal family systems is it's as simple as we have different parts that make us that form who we are. And it might be something like, I have a part that wants to go exercise today, and I have a part that doesn't want to go exercise today. And it explains why we have different feelings about different situations, and they're not necessarily wrong. So that,
Hmm.
and I'll say more about that, but the internal family systems it's a model and a way of being that engages people in a non-pathologizing way. And so what I mean by that is, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened, and how are your defenses influencing you in your relationships, how you view the world, and how you heal yourself. So that's kind of a broad overview. My training started with Derek Scott in his Stepping Stones program with the IFS, Internal Family Systems of Canada. I followed up with, I'm level 2 trained through the IFS Institute. What happened was, in my training along the way, I found that there was not really anything that talked about the kind of the way in for men. And I have all of this experience, but I had a lot of questions about what's the way in for men. So that was the genesis of this podcast. I wanted to create, based on my background, um, an experience and a way to engage men in a way that's very powerful. I think one of the things that I found out with IFS is that it's a modality that is very deep and very impactful. I found that through my clients, and I found that personally. As soon as I started doing IFS with clients, it drew them in a much deeper way. And I think of therapy can be outside in or inside out. And IFS is an inside out version, where you start from the origin of what happened and look at how you're responding to maybe what we would call triggers, and how do we heal that? It's not just deal with it, but how do we heal that? The outside in approach might be something like cognitive behavioral therapy, or DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which are strategies and tools to kind of deal with the present moment. So IFS really goes back to our early childhood. I
Hmm. Maybe I could ask you to elaborate a little bit about the structure of the parts and how they show up specifically for men, and how do we access these parts, and what do we do with them?
Yeah, very, very broadly speaking, in IFS, we talk about managers, firefighters, and self. And so the self is the core of who we are, and the self has very specific qualities about who we are. And it's been divided into the 8 C's. It's way more complex than that, but it's caring, compassionate, creative, courageous, connected are some of the 8 C's. Those are the qualities of self. Those are present no matter who is in front of us, no matter who we're working with. The self is always there, but like the sun, which can get obscured by clouds, the self can be obscured by these other parts. And these parts formed to help us cope with some what I'll call traumatic events. And those can be big T trauma or little t trauma. The little t trauma might be something that has been referred to as developmental trauma. So that might be neglect, or it might be how a family interacted with a child. It's not as obvious. It's not as obviously impactful as physical abuse or sexual abuse, but it's the kind of thing that it's more subtle and can last a lifetime, as can all of the other kinds of trauma that happen. What happens when we experience trauma is that it impacts ourselves at that moment. And it's as if we get frozen in time. We have a system that kind of comes in to help protect us and not feel those difficult emotions, the terror and the sadness and the grief and the loss. So that what we call is that part that gets frozen in time is the exile, and the exile takes on what are called burdens. And there's the to protect that exile are the firefighters and the managers. So a firefighter might be drinking, it might be drugs. It's something that is reactive. It's something that puts the fire out. So if we are triggered in some way by a situation that reminds us of the past, the firefighter comes in, we choose that path, and it puts those feelings out right away. It could be exercise, it could be addiction of many different ways. It could be watching Netflix as a way to kind of numb ourselves out. Dissociation is another way to do that. There's also a part of us called managers, and the managers are proactive. They are, for example, they are our thinking parts. They're the parts that are planners. They are the parts that show up oftentimes at work that are very highly valued. But in a sense, they are, when they get moved into a hyperdrive, they become maladaptive. So if we are only focused on the specifics of a project, on the or the cognitive aspect of a situation, those are the managers that are working to keep those difficult feelings at bay. So we've got the
Mm-hmm.
exiles, we've got the managers, we've got the firefighters, and the self as a part of that. And when those difficult feelings and emotions get sort of trapped in the exile, we form these protective features that help to keep us safe and help us to not experience those difficult emotions and thoughts. There's also an aspect of internal family systems that is called what we call legacy, cultural or legacy burdens. So those are aspects of us that get handed down from generation to generation. Those could be alcoholism. Those could be eating behaviors, how we self-soothe ourselves. There's also what we would call heirlooms. So there's legacy burdens and legacy heirlooms. Those are the positive aspects that have been handed down from generation to generation. And so how does that present in men? Well, that's part of the exploration of this podcast and what interests me. But maybe we would think about a male part is the breadwinner, the person who's in charge of making money for the family. Maybe we would think about the father who's a protector. Maybe a man part might be a fighter. Those are the ones that come to mind readily that are more specifically male specific, and not that women
Mm-hmm.
can't or don't do those parts or can't have those parts be activated, but those are the ones that I believe men are activated in a unique way. And is what this podcast is about, is learning about those specific patterns that men have developed uniquely as a result of the context and history of any given man. I also want to mention that I'm using the term man and male and masculinities generically, but it's obviously far more complex than that. And there are a rainbow of men who are a part of our humanity: black, brown, African American, Hispanic, Asian, and all of the diversity that are found in there. And those, we all have different experiences. I grew up in Wisconsin. Someone grew up in Los Angeles. Those are very different experiences and contexts that also need to be talked about. There are layers of power and privilege that intersect with the conversation around men and masculinity and gender that's also important to talk about. And how we engage with sports, how we engage with men's violence, how we engage with relationships. Those are shaped by culture, context, and history, and that will be a part of this podcast as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, sounds really interesting, and the IFS framework seems like a very thorough perspective. It kind of considers all of the all of the aspects. And my next question is, why do you think right now is an important moment to have this conversation, to have a podcast like this, to spread information?
Yeah, the one aspect that I want to also name is there are some through lines that in the diversity of men that are really present throughout, and that have been a dynamic at play that has had some changes, but have remained fairly consistent over time. So, um, if you say the phrase "be a man," there are some very common ways of defining that or answering that about what a man is. And oftentimes, some of those commonalities are things like being tough, being strong, as I said, being the breadwinner. I think another assumed, both implicitly and explicitly, is be heterosexual, be straight, be an athlete, be all the things that we be without emotions. Men don't cry. All of the things that we think of that are traditional male masculinities, and there are dynamics involved with that it's been called the man box. Paul Kivel and his group in the 70s created this structure called the man box. So we are those aspects of us of being a man are inside the box, and if any time we step outside the box, that there are aspects of culture that work explicitly, viciously, strongly to keep us in the box. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
those are the words that if a man steps out of the box, he's a pussy, or he's a wimp, or he's a girl, or he's gay, and all the words and different kind of words and slurs that we might use to describe any of those terms. Um, those are used to keep men in the box, and that box and the effects of that box have been pretty commonly present, and I would say have been amplified most recently. But the effects of being in that box is that men have high rates of depression. The effects of that box means that men have had high rates of alcoholism and suicide and depression. As I said, there are many ways in which men really suffer in our society, and as much as men benefit in a structural economic way, from an emotional and relational way, men are really suffer. We look at that. There's been a lot of conversation around men and depression and men and loneliness. And we know, especially with younger groups, but not exclusively, there are high rates of depression, and men and boys are talking about the what we've called the loneliness epidemic. So there are those, we're naming those things now, and now we're in an age for the last 10 years or so. I would say that we're in a really regressive moment where we are the culture is at least sort of publicly naming that we want to go back to a certain way of being, and that men are supposed to be, that men and warriors and athletes are supposed to be a certain way. And there's a feel and an actual movement towards stamping out emotion and health and all that means. And so, why this podcast? Why now? I think that men are in a lot of pain, and I think that we are expressing it in different ways. And honestly, the way it often gets expressed is either through our own addictions, as IFS has talked about and as framed as one of our firefighters, or externally in our violence against each other, and in our violence against women, and it's shockingly high. I also want to
Mm-hmm.
name, if you're reading the newspaper, it's if there's a shooter in a high school or a grade school, it's almost always a man. If there's a sexual assault, it's almost always a man. The numbers are overwhelmingly leaning in that way. So the upstream from that is that men are lonely, men are depressed, men are not happy, they're struggling in their relationships. What I've seen is the promise and the experience that I've seen is that IFS gives men and women an opportunity to come home to ourselves, to be much more in tune with who we are, what we want, how we love in the world. And I see that as a desperate need for the men in the world right now. And IFS
Mm-hmm.
is a way in. And so what interests me is how can we support the development of strategies or ways of thinking about this internal family systems that helps make it the most effective that it can be.
Right. And it almost moves into my next question, which is how can we approach men's mental health from a perspective of IFS, and how can we apply IFS practically to maybe start having the discussion, to start having the insight into men's internal life, into men's mental health and their inner world.
Well, yes, that's the question that we are asking through the podcast. How to best engage men. What we know through research is, and through my own experience, men are overwhelmingly allergic to therapy. We don't like it. And if you think about the man box, to be asked to go in and talk to a man or a woman about your feelings, you have all of those voices in your head of being not a man, and it's the way forward to come home to your children and your marriage and your relationships is through that internal work, to be better men and fathers and friends. And I believe IFS has that potential. But one of the main issues we see is that men don't go to therapy and they don't stay in therapy. So that's a question that I'm interested in asking. I know from my experience, men come to therapy because their partner said you have to go to therapy, not because they have an innate desire to improve themselves. And I would say that that has changed generationally, that younger men feel more comfortable to go into therapy. But I think it's still an issue about how to continue to engage them. Are there different ways that we can use? Men tend to be much more transactional and instrumental. So maybe it's in the context of going on a walk with a man, maybe there's some way we incorporate it into other activities, or maybe it's a retreat that's more focused on men, that has sort of a unique environment and context. But honestly, that's what I'm interested in talking about, is how do we engage men in this very effective and very deep way of healing? What's the best way in to do that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, yeah. And I would like to hear maybe a little bit more of your perspective on, in IFS terms, what would constitute a healthy or an integrated self or a healthy masculinity? Let's say, what would it mean from parts kind of perspective? How do they come together to create an integrated psyche, or how do they come about? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, we think about internal family systems. It's like an external family system. We have brothers and sisters and communities that we live in. In our restricted or regressed self, men don't make friendships. They don't have support systems outside of their marriage and their relationships, generally speaking. So, an integrated and healthy man starts to understand and engage with himself first. So, he's building attachment and love and compassion for himself. And so, that takes time to sort that out. It takes time to go back in and see what our younger selves experienced, and help those parts of us that were harmed and injured and traumatized, so that we can help these external behaviors that keep us from being friends with people, that keep us from being good brothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and what have you. I think
Mm-hmm.
that the loneliness epidemic for men is that we're not connected to ourselves first. We're not kind of at ease with ourselves, and that's what internal family systems does. I would say what's unique about this podcast is understanding men and masculinity. Like, what is moving towards a healthy masculinity? What does that look like? And part of that looks like it's bringing some kind of understanding and grappling with what is healthy masculinity, and it may be a different relationship with our partners. It may be a different way of looking at sports and leisure, but I think that it is first and foremost starts with ourselves. Well, I just saw a recent study that they surveyed 15,000 men, and of that, about 11% met criteria for what they would call toxic masculinity. And the author was saying that that's a small number. If you think about it, that's 1,500 men out of that 15,000 who are really in this range of a very, very unhealthy relationship with themselves and others. I would argue that all that comes out of that's an extreme that got captured in that study, and that there's all of the men who don't exhibit those kind of verbal externalized anger towards other men, towards other races, towards women, there's a continuum that upholds, and that men on that continuum, that concept of toxic masculinity doesn't capture the specifics of the suffering that the other
Mm-hmm.
90% are experiencing with themselves, how they're engaging, and how they get help and they heal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, and it sounds like this IFS perspective specifically is a wonderful tool for fostering self-awareness and becoming more aware of those different parts and how they show up. And my question is, on a more broad perspective, let's say, what do we hope to see long term, sort of in the culture, in families, in work dynamics? What would be the positive outcome of using this approach, of having this discussion, of having this dialogue with men?
It's a great question. I mean, I think this podcast, and when you think about therapy, it's dealing with one man, one person at a time. So it's kind of a micro perspective. But that is that's a drop in the ocean that kind of resonates out. And what I would hope is that we bring more humanity back, and I think that's what it can do. It can do for men and women, but particularly men. There's a way in which we objectify the world. We turn the world into tasks and doing, and we turn the world into good and bad. And I guess my hope is that we would choose how we treat our neighbors, how we treat our family, how we treat other countries, how we share or don't share our resources, how we let people into our country, how we greet them. I think that there's many ways. I guess my hope and my vision is that this helps men. The outcomes of this podcast and the outcomes of IFS is to help men be better men and to bring more humanness to them, so they're not trapped in these old ways of being.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And more practically speaking, what is the future of the podcast? And do you have any fun guests coming up, or what kind of perspectives we will be hearing from? And who are we going to see on this podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question. My first episode will feature Bob Falconer, who's a senior trainer. He's written numerous books. He's really a wonderful resource in the IFS community, and he will particularly talk to the kind of the broader cultural and legacy impact of men and healing and spirituality, and then everywhere in between. And will invite experts in the field on topics of men and feelings, men and therapy, men and body image, men and anger, men and emotions, men in relationship with food. All of the topics that we can imagine that define and flow through our lives will be a part of the podcast going forward.
Okay, sounds great. And maybe closing thoughts. What has been your own experience with IFS? Why were you attracted to it, and what's the most important takeaways that you have from this experience?
Yeah, I mean I came to IFS through it was more of a curiosity, and I'd heard about it. I saw Dick Schwartz in a particular training that he led, and I was intrigued by it, and I started sharing the perspective of IFS with my clients, and they kind of caught fire with it. It really surprised me. I didn't see that coming, and so I grabbed any kind of training I could find to study IFS, and just saw the impact on my clients. I've done my own internal family systems work, and I feel much more grounded, much more at home in myself, much more hopeful in the world, and much more aware of myself. And I think that's what I really, really am passionate about, that I want to bring to men and others, is this pathway of healing that really works.
Mm-hmm. A really tangible and visible outcome, which
Yep.
is very
Yep.
important. So it sounds really practical. And are there some kind of IFS tools or some easy tools which anybody can do at home, or identify some part or something which is easy to do at home for self-reflection purposes, let's say?
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess what I would refer people to is there's a lot of books out there that they can start with. Dick Schwartz has written a number of books. No Bad Parts is kind of a classic that's really helpful. There's a book for couples to do work. That Dick Schwartz has a workbook on on IFS that's very helpful. I have found that it really is important to do the work with a guide, with a therapist, with somebody who knows the
Mm-hmm.
model. And so it's starting that. But if there were a starting place, and this is often where I start with my clients, we call it parts detection and parts mapping.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really starting. You start with just noticing, and the noticing is, if you feel yourself reacting really strongly to a situation that doesn't quite, doesn't match the facts of what's going on, that's often what we call a trailhead. So just noticing, oh, I got really angry about that, or it was really sad, or I was really hard on myself. So thinking about those sorts of things, and they might be, in IFS, we might think about it as like a inner critic, or an inner judge, where we're judging ourselves or criticizing ourselves. So that would be parts detection, really just noticing. And just noticing can be very powerful. The next step
Mm-hmm.
is to do what we call parts mapping. So we look at what the parts are, when they arise, and how they relate to each other. And that's really the start of IFS therapy, is being able to identify the parts and see how they interrelate, and then work with an IFS therapist who can help you navigate that journey. It can be very confusing, and it doesn't. It I think it feels kind of weird because it feels like you're talking to yourself, but we all talk to ourselves. So it's important to have that guide. But there are great resources out there as a starting point. There's podcasts, obviously. There's meditations that focus on what IFS is, and the books are. I mean, we've got a really nice collection of books to help people.
Hmm. So sounds like the beginning, the important part is approaching ourselves with from a place of curiosity instead of judgment and seeing where it leads us.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the this idea of self is that if you can bring curiosity to yourself, it's very powerful. And I'll say just curiosity, but there's something that's very disarming about being curious. It's very different. We call it a U-turn. If you're angry about something, to rather than get frustrated with it, but to turn towards that part of us and be curious and see what that's about. The whole idea of no bad parts is that they're not wrong. They came out of a certain context, and really, it's these parts just need to be listened to. They need to be heard. They need to be given voice to. And when we do that, that's where the magic happens. They start to settle and relax. And out of that is where energy lives. Out of that is where joy lives. Out of that is where grieving lives as well. It's the place where
Hmm.
we can connect with ourselves.
Become more human.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
Well, that's all from my side. Thank you for this conversation. It's been very interesting. A lot of things to think about, and I'm excited to see how this podcast takes shape in the future. And is there anything else you would like to add?
I don't think so. We can stop there.
Okay, we can stop there. What about where can we find you? Where can we reach out to you? How can we find the
You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, wherever
Okay,
you can find podcasts.
great. Perfect. Thank you so much.